When I was growing up, I always thought that Korea had been divided forever. And when the Cold War ended, I assumed that the division between North and South would finally disappear. But then the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Korea is still divided today. So why is that? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain everything you need to know about the Korean War and why North and South Korea are still divided today. All right, let's start at the beginning. Before the end of World War II, Korea had been a unified country for thousands of years. But after Japan surrendered in 1945, the victorious Allies decided to split the peninsula along the 38th parallel. The plan was for this division to only last until a unified and democratic government could be established. But things didn't really work out that way. In the South, the U.S. backed a government led by Syngman Rhee, who was a staunch anti-communist. In the North, the Soviets backed a communist government led by Kim Il-sung, who wanted to reunify the peninsula under communist rule. Unfortunately, these two leaders were completely opposed to each other and couldn't come to an agreement on how to unify the peninsula peacefully. So they remained divided, which was exactly what the superpowers wanted. As you can imagine, the Americans wanted to contain the spread of communism in Asia, just as the Soviets wanted to spread communism throughout Asia. By establishing this division, they effectively created a buffer zone and started what would become known as the Cold War. Both of these leaders would stay in power for decades. Syngman Rhee ruled the South from 1948 to 1960, and Kim Il-sung ruled the North from 1948 to 1994. So now that we have all of that background information out of the way, let's talk about the actual war. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea with a massive and overwhelming force. Within 3 days, they had taken over half of the peninsula. It seemed like the North Koreans were going to take over the South and unify the peninsula once and for all. But then, something interesting happened. Instead of retreating, the South Korean army made a daring attack on Incheon, which was a city about 20 miles from the capital of Seoul. With the help of American troops, they landed behind enemy lines and cut off North Korea's supply chain. This battle turned the tide of the war and pushed North Korean forces all the way back to here. But then Chinese troops intervened, pushing them back down to around here. And this is where the fighting pretty much stayed for the next 2 years. There were many more major battles that took place, such as the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, but none of them resulted in either side gaining any significant territory. Overall, this brutal stalemate resulted in millions of military deaths and civilian casualties on both sides. Entire villages and cities were wiped off the map. Infrastructure was destroyed, and the peninsula was left in ruins. And yet, by the end of the war, there was very little change in territory. So if both sides suffered so much and gained nothing, then why did they keep fighting? Well, the answer is simple. Both sides wanted to win the war and occupy the entire peninsula. The fighting continued until July of 1953, when an armistice was signed. But remember, an armistice is not the same thing as a peace treaty. A peace treaty means that the war is over. An armistice simply means that the fighting has stopped. Today, the Korean peninsula is still divided along almost the exact same line that was drawn after World War II. There is a 2-mile-wide demilitarized zone, or DMZ, that runs across the peninsula. And although soldiers aren't allowed in this zone, it does technically still exist. Now that you understand what happened during the war, let's talk about why the division still matters today. First of all, the Korean War solidified the Cold War divide in Asia. Before the war, there was a real possibility that Korea could have been reunited as one peaceful and democratic country. But after the war, the peninsula was firmly planted in the Soviet sphere of influence in the north and the American sphere of influence in the south. Furthermore, the war turned North Korea into an isolated dictatorship, while the South eventually developed into a thriving democracy. These two Koreas have very different political systems, cultures, religions, and ways of life. So even if reunification were to happen today, it's likely that they would continue to be divided in many ways for decades to come. In fact, There have been several attempts to reunify the peninsula since the armistice was signed, but all of them have failed. For example, the two Koreas competed against each other in the Olympics for decades. They also held family reunions for relatives who were separated during the war. But even these small acts of cooperation were eventually discontinued. Another reason why the division still matters is because North Korea has arguably become the most dangerous dictatorship on planet Earth. After the armistice was signed, the North Koreans began developing nuclear weapons to use as leverage against the South. This has caused the United States to station 28,500 troops in South Korea to this day. Even though those troops are there to protect South Korea, it also prevents the North from invading because they know that the U.S. will intervene. And finally, the division still matters because it's possible that the two Koreas could go back to war. As I mentioned earlier, there are still tens of thousands of armed soldiers on both sides of that DMZ. Every year, there are reports of North Korean soldiers defecting to the South, and occasionally the North conducts military drills near the border. The threat of another Korean war may seem far-fetched today, but considering the history of the two Koreas, it's definitely a possibility. So now you know why the division between North and South Korea still exists today. Let me leave you with one last thought. Imagine living your entire life believing that the country you live in owns all of Korea, that its destiny is to reunify the peninsula under its rule. Now imagine that the other side feels the exact same way. You have two Koreas with the same language, culture, and history, yet they're divided and hostile towards each other. And we may never know for sure, but it's possible that this division may have been exactly what the superpowers wanted all along. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about other conflicts around the world, I highly recommend checking out my channel where I post videos about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Syrian civil war, and many other topics. Thanks for watching.